Right, well, welcome to the third of these lectures. Um, Today we're going to be looking specifically at inflectional morphology and something called head movement. This is something that we haven't yet introduced, but it is an important aspect of syntactic analysis of sentences. Um, that we also have another kind of process which is involved in forming sentences, which isn't just the X bar kind of structure that we've been looking at, but involves another kind of process that actually moves things about. Okay, what that's all about will become clear, I hope, as we proceed. Let's go on first to start with a recap of what we've said last week. Last week we introduced the full X bar theory, including the X part and the bar part, where we said that there are these two rules, very general rules for all kinds of phrases, depending on what the category X stands for: nouns, verbs, prepositions, determiners, inflections, or whatever. Okay, and there are the two rules which produce these three levels of the structure. Down at the bottom we have the head plus its complement. Those two things go together to form the X bar. So that second rule there, the X bar is made up of the head plus the YP. Then the first rule puts the top on the phrase, so the XP is made up of a specifier phrase in front of the X bar, and that's as far as the whole thing goes. So there are these three levels: the phrase level, the bar level, and the head level, the zero level sometimes it's referred to as. Specifically then, the analysis we put forward last week was for clauses, is that the clause has the inflection as its head. The clause goes together with the verb phrase in the complement position to form the I bar, and the inflection goes together with the VP to form the I bar, and then the subject is in the specifier position going along with the I bar to form the IP. So we can get a sentence like John will win. Okay, that's the bracketed part of this larger sentence. I think John will win. John is the subject in the specifier. Will, the modal auxiliary, is an inflection in the head position, and win is obviously the verb phrase in that complement position. Okay, now the reason why I'm putting these things in embedded clauses will become apparent when we move on. But for now, let's just look at the different types of clauses that we can get. Okay, so with John will win, we have a modal in that inflection position, and we have a finite clause. But there are other kinds of clauses. For example, we have a to element that could go in that inflection position, as in John to win. And John to win is an infinitival clause because the inflection there is an infinitive kind of inflection. To marks the infinitive clause. And these kinds of clauses can only appear in embedded clauses. That's why we need to have the embedded clause here so that we can compare the two. There's another kind of finite clause as well, which appears to somehow lack something that the other two have, in as much as you only get two words. This is something like John won. However, we've pointed out that this does in fact contain something that the other two don't have, and specifically that is the tense that appears on the verb. Now, this is a rather abstract kind of analysis. We say that, well, something must occupy that inflection position because that's the head position, and all phrases have to have heads. But furthermore, you can't have any of the other kinds of inflections in such a sentence. You can't say John will won or John to won. So there's got to be something in there, but it's not entirely obvious what the nature of that thing is. Furthermore, there is something that we can see, and that lands upon the verb. The verb is in a different form. Now, this kind of verb that we're looking at here is, is one of the irregular forms. So we don't really see the difference between the verb itself and the past tense. But in other more regular cases, we do see that there is a morpheme attached to the verb. Typically, it's a ud type thing, as in smile plus smiled. Okay, so there we see that there's a morpheme on the verb. Now, what's the relationship between that morpheme and the tense inflection? At the moment, those sorts of questions aren't very easy to answer from what we've said so far. That's what we're going to be looking at in the rest of this lecture. But before we get onto that, I need to introduce something more that also will justify us using these embedded clauses. Okay, so what we've said then is that we've got a sentence structure that looks like this. It's an IP with a subject, an inflection, and a verb phrase. Now, in embedded clauses, you can also get something else accompanying such clauses. So, for example, you can say, I think John will win, but you can also say, I think that John will win. And that's got this extra word that in it. Now, this word is a member of a category which has been called a complementizer. Complementizers are words which introduce clauses. They come in front of clauses, and specifically they come in front of embedded clauses. Okay, you don't get a complementizer in a main clause that you can see. So they are specifically restricted to embedded clauses. Okay. Now, the question is, where is that complementizer when it appears with a clause? Well, first of all, note it can't be part of the inflectional phrase itself, for the simple reason that all the positions inside the IP are already filled by something. There are three positions inside any phrase, three possible positions according to X-bar theory: specifier, head, and complement. And in the IP, all of those three positions are taken. The subject is in the specifier position, the inflection is in the inflection head position, and the verb phrase is in the complement position. So there's no vacant position for the complementizer to sit. So clearly the complementizer lies outside of the IP. However, there is evidence to suggest that the complementizer does form a constituent with the following inflectional phrase. And the evidence in favour of that is the fact that you can coordinate such a constituent. Okay, take this example. I think that John will win, or that he will be second. Here we're coordinating two constituents, that John will win and that he will be second, with the conjunct or, the disjunction. And the fact is that you can only coordinate things which are constituents. So the fact that you can coordinate a complementizer plus an inflectional phrase with another complementizer plus an inflectional phrase goes to show us that complementizer plus the inflectional phrase form a constituent, a phrase of some sort. Of course, the question is, well, what's the nature of that phrase? What kind of a phrase do we get by putting a complementizer and an inflectional phrase together? Well, consider the following. Complementizer is a word. Okay, clearly it's just a word all by itself. You can't expand it into anything bigger than the word that in this particular case. All words are heads. According to X-bar theory, there's only one position for a word to go in, and that's a head position. Now, what we've got here is a phrase, an XP. We're looking for the head for that phrase to know what phrase it is. Well, the most obvious solution to the problems we've got is to assume that the head of this phrase is indeed the complementizer, which is a head looking for a phrase. So if the complementizer is the head of this phrase, that phrase is a complementizer phrase. And that's the kind of structure that we propose. Okay, the complementizer is the head, heading a complementizer phrase, and the IP is inside that. But not only is the IP inside the complementizer phrase, but it's in a particular position inside it. It follows the complementizer. We know that the phrase that follows the complementizer is the complement position. So the analysis we come to then is that the complementizer is the head of the CP, and the inflectional phrase goes in the complement position of the complementizer. Okay, now we have some evidence that that is actually true. Let's first of all look at the claim that the complementizer is the head of some phrase or other. Do complementizers behave like heads? Well, one thing we know is that heads restrict their complements. Okay, that's one factor of a head. Moreover, different types of heads restrict their complements in different ways. Complementizers are obviously of the kind of head that is like an inflection or a determiner. They are functional categories. They're not these kinds of categories like verbs and nouns, which carry very much semantic meaning. In fact, it's not entirely clear what the semantic meaning a complementizer does carry. We'll sort of see that slightly later on. But they're clearly not thematic heads. And we know that all of the other functional heads impose very strict restrictions on their complements. Inflections only ever take a verb phrase complement, and determiners only ever take an NP complement. Well, what's true about complementizers? We know that a complementizer can take an IP complement. Is it possible that they can take any other kind of complement? Well, here we've got a clause with an IP with a complementizer sitting in the subject position of another clause. So that John will win is clear. Okay. Now, in this case, actually, the complementizer is obligatory. You can't miss it out. You can't say John will win is clear. So complementizers in this case is not an option, but an obligation. Now, we can have other phrases in the subject position of a clause. For example, we can get a DP there, so as in the weather is clear. But note, you can't have a complementizer in front of that kind of subject. You can't say that the weather is clear. You can have a preposition phrase as the subject, so in the valley is clear. But you can't have a complementizer in front of that. You can't say that in the valley is clear. Okay, so it looks as though that the complementizer restricts whatever is in its complement position purely to IPs. And we know heads restrict complements. And the fact that the complementizer restricts the thing that follows it shows us that actually the complementizer is behaving like a head, and furthermore that the inflectional phrase is behaving like its complement. Okay, so we can find evidence that the complementizer is the head taking IP as its complement. Now, some more facts about complementizers before we get on to the what we're supposed to be talking about, which is the inflection. And that is, well, there are different types of complementizers. There's obviously more than one complementizer. That is one of them. But if you compare that sentence, that John will win could be likely, to another sentence, for John to win would be desirable, we can see that in this case we have a word for in front of the inflectional phrase John to win. Okay, so for would seem to be another instance of a complementizer. However, it isn't the fact that you can easily interchange these things. In fact, wherever you can get a that, you can't get a for, and wherever you can get a for, you can't get a that. So if you tried to replace the word that with the for, you would get an ungrammatical for John will win, could be likely. And if you did the same with the for, with replacing it with that, you'd also get an equally ungrammatical that John to win would be desirable. So it seems as though that and for are not interchangeable. They go in the same structural position, but what's different about them is which kind of clause they introduce. That is a complementizer that can only introduce finite clauses, and you can't get it introducing a non-finite clause like John to win. For, on the other hand, is a complementizer which only ever introduces non-finite clauses like John to win. and you can't get it in front of a finite clause like John will win. Okay. And again, this is showing us that the complementizers are behaving like heads, because we know different heads select for different kinds of complements. That is the kind of complementizer which selects an IP, but not only just IPs, but also finite IPs as its complement. Selects for infinitival clause complements. Now, there's a third possible complementizer, as we can see in this example. I asked if John can win. Note here we've got this word if, and that's sitting in pretty much the same position that we've seen that and for sitting in. It comes in front of the IP, John can win. Now, if we look at that, we see that if is a kind of complementizer that can introduce a finite clause. So if seems to be like that in this case. However, it can't be exactly like that, because if that were true, we would think you'd be able to replace if with that, and you can't. You can't say, I asked that John can win. So what's the difference between if and that? They both introduce finite clauses, but there must be a difference. Well, we can see that there is a difference between these clauses if we see what else can appear as the complement of the verb ask. Ask is the kind of a verb that takes a clausal complement, but not just a clausal complement, a specific type of clausal complement. Specifically, it can take what is called an interrogative clause, i.e. a clause that is used to ask a question. And that makes sense because the verb ask is precisely means that kind of thing. If you ask something, you ask a question. So ask takes interrogative clauses as its complement. Okay, so we can have ask who will win, but we can also have ask if John can win. So if seems to be the kind of complementizer which introduces an interrogative clause. That, on the other hand, clearly can't introduce an interrogative clause. You can't say, I asked that John can win. Instead, what we've got to have there is that introduces a declarative clause, a clause that makes a statement, the kind of clause that can be the complement of a verb like to think. When you think statements, you don't think questions as such. So we can see that introduces not only finite clauses, but declarative type clauses, and if introduces interrogative clauses. So there's a two-way distinction between complementizers and the clauses that they introduce. We can see that by looking at this table here. We got on the one axis the distinction between finite and infinitival clause complements, and on the other axis the difference between a declarative and an interrogative type complement. Okay, that is the kind of complementizer that introduces a finite declarative clause. For is the kind of complementizer that introduces infinitival declarative clauses. And if introduces finite interrogative clauses. Now there appears to be a gap in that table there for the complementizer introducing the infinitival interrogative, and that seems to be an accidental gap. We don't really have a complementizer for that particular function. Okay, so there are just three complementizers in English, and therefore this is a fairly simple kind of category. Okay, it's time to get back to the point that we're going to be making here about the tensed clauses and the relationship between tense and the morpheme you get on the verb. Okay, so here's the structure for the kind of clause that we're thinking of here. I think that John smiled. We've got the CP, that John smiled, containing the IP, John smiled, in its complement position. Okay, this is a tensed sentence, so there's got to be something in that inflection position for the time being. We just sort of say some kind of abstract tense element. And this time we've got the verb smiled, where we can see there's a verb, smile, and a morpheme, ud. So what is the relationship between that abstract tense position and that morpheme? Well, I think the most A concrete analysis that we could give here is that we don't need any abstract elements. What we could just simply say is that the inflection here really is that tense morpheme. Okay, that is what tense is. It's the morpheme itself, and that's what's sitting in the the inflection position. Okay, the verb sits in the verb position, and those two things are separate. Now, one piece of evidence that we have that would seem to suggest that that is the right way of looking at it is that you can actually voice the tense in that position separate from the verb. In some circumstances, particularly if you want to stress this position here, you can do so by actually expressing that tense as a word all by itself. So, for example, I know that John did smile, stressing the tense there. The tense is then now expressed as a word all by itself, separate from the verb to smile. We get this what is called a dummy auxiliary do inserted, and that it just expresses, the only thing that expresses is the tense. So that's like pronouncing the tense in that position. Okay, and as we can see, the position it is in is exactly the position we predict for it. Okay, but if you don't want to stress the tense, what's going on there? Because what ends up happening is that the tense and the verb somehow get together and form a single unit. Now, I think we can understand that by looking at the nature of this inflection. The other inflections that we've looked at, the modals and the to in the infinitives, they are free morphemes. They're morphemes that can stand all by themselves and don't need anything special happening to them. But tense, like ud and s in present tense sentences, these are bound morphemes. And bound morphemes need to stick onto something. It's part of their nature. So what seems to be happening is that the nature of this inflection, the bound morpheme, tense inflection, is going to force something else to happen. And of course, that something else has got to be that the verb has somehow got to get together with the tense element. And I think the most concrete thing we can suggest there is that, well, something moves. Okay, either the verb moves, as we've got here, to the inflection position, or perhaps the inflection moves to the verb and sticks itself onto the verb. Something moves. And what it is that moves is clearly a head. Okay, it's either the verb or the inflection, both of those are heads. So this is an instance of something we might refer to as head movement. And it turns out there are more head movements than the one involved here. This is a fairly general kind of process that we find in structures. Heads can move from one head position to another. Okay, now let's look at the details of this a bit more carefully to try and figure out, see if we can figure out what is actually happening. Okay, so here's what we're saying we start off with. We start with the ud in the inflection position and the verb in the verb position, as you would expect. Inflections go in head positions and verbs go in head positions of verb phrases. And one possibility is that what happens is that the verb moves to the inflection position. However, we also have the other possibility, that it's the inflection that's moving and sticking itself onto the end of the verb. Now note, both of those processes would produce exactly the same result. We still end up with the CP, that John smiled. Okay, it's just that, well, the verb ends up in a different position in both cases. In the first case, if the verb moves to the inflection, well, the tensed verb is in the inflection position. But if the inflection moves to the verb, then the tensed verb is in the verb phrase, in the verb position. So which one of these is right, and how could we possibly tell, given that they both seem to produce exactly the same order of elements? Well, there is a way of telling, and it's precisely to do with the order of elements, because after all, in principle, we should be able to tell whether the verb is sitting in one position or another when those two positions are actually different positions. Now, in order to see how we're going to tell that, let's have a look at a different sentence. Here we've got a sentence with a a free morpheme, the modal will, in the inflection position, and obviously then the verb is inside the verb phrase there. So John will be happy, we've got will in the inflection, and be happy is the verb phrase, and be is the verb inside the VP. Now, we can do something to this sentence. We can turn it into a negative sentence. And when we do that, we add this negative word not. And note the position that it occupies is between the inflection and the verb phrase. We won't go into the details here about which exactly is the position it occupies, but just note that it occupies some position between the inflection and the VP. And that's all that we need to know. Now, if we have a tensed version of this without the free morpheme modal there, but we've just got a tense morpheme, and that is going to get together with the verb, we end up with John is happy. Now, the question is that verb is, the tensed version of the verb to be, in the inflection position? Did the be move to the inflection, or did the inflection move to the verb position, and so the whole thing is in the V position? How can we tell? Well, we can tell by sticking in the not, because we know the not comes between the inflection and the VP. And if the inflection has moved to the verb and the verb is inside the VP, we predict that it should be grammatical to have not in front of the verb. And as you can see, the result is that's not grammatical. You can't say, I think that John not is happy. What you have to say is the be in front of the not. Okay, I think John is not happy, and therefore we have direct evidence that it's the verb that moves to the inflection, not the inflection that moves to the verb. Okay, now in order to extend this a bit further, we can see that there are other instances which we might analyse as involving the movement of a head. Consider this sentence, can John win? This is an interrogative. Specifically, it's a yes-no question, because the answer to it is either going to be yes or no. And it involves a syntactic phenomenon known as inversion, inasmuch as the order of the subject and the inflection is inverted. As we know, the typical order of the subject and the inflection is that the subject comes first and the inflection follows it. And that's because the inflection is the head of an IP and the subject is in the specifier position. Specifiers precede heads. So the normal order is going to be subject first, followed by the inflection. But with an inverted structure, we get the opposite order. So what's gone on? Well, one fairly straightforward analysis would be to say that what's happened here is that the inflection has moved. And it's moved from the inflection position to a position in front of the subject. Now we know that the subject is in the first position inside the IP, so the position in front of the subject has got to be outside of the IP, and we know that the element that sits in the position right in front of the IP outside of it is the complementizer. So therefore it seems as though this kind of inversion could be analysed as movement from the inflection position into the complementizer position. Do we have any evidence that that's true? Well, one piece of evidence would be if the inverted auxiliary moves into the complementizer position, we would predict that it should be impossible to have an inverted auxiliary at the same time as a complementizer, because they're both trying to occupy exactly the same position. In other words, they should be in complementary distribution if they both occupy the same position. The problem is, however, with that is that the facts conspire against us to try and come up with the evidence that that is in fact a true statement. And the reason for this is, well, partly because you never get complementizers in main clauses. You can't say that John is happy as a main clause. You can only have a complementizer in an embedded clause. I think that John is happy. So no complementizers appear in main clauses. Now, exactly the opposite is true of inverted auxiliaries. You can get an inverted auxiliary in a main clause, as in is John happy, But you can't get an inverted auxiliary in an embedded clause. You can't say, I wonder, is John happy? Okay, so no inversion takes place in an embedded clause. Therefore, we can never come up with a clause where we would expect both of these things to appear, because they both appear in different types of clauses. In fact, the way to pronounce an embedded yes-no question is precisely with the complementizer if. Okay, and you can get complementizers in embedded clauses, but not inverted auxiliaries. So it looks as though we just simply cannot form the evidence that we need to show that complementizers and inverted auxiliaries are in complementary distribution with each other. However, there is one happy coincidence here, and that is there are in fact clauses where you can get either a complementizer or an inverted auxiliary. And these are these kinds of clauses we see here. If John had been happy, he would have won. This is the clause in the brackets there, the if John had been happy, is an instance of what we call a conditional clause. It sets out the condition for the truth of the following clause. He would have won is conditional on if John had been happy. Okay, so here we've got a conditional clause beginning with the complementizer if. Okay, it has this kind of structure, and we've got if in the complementizer position and followed by the IP John had been happy. We also have another possible way of expressing the same conditional clause. If you know about conditional clauses, you know that you can also have an inverted auxiliary version of them. So had John been happy, he would have won. What we seem to have there is the auxiliary in the complementizer position in front of the subject. Now, if both of those are possible, then we might predict that we can have the if and the inverted auxiliary together at the same time. And lo and behold, that's not possible. You can't have if and have in the same clause in that same position. And that would lead us to the conclusion that the inverted auxiliary is indeed trying to occupy the complementizer position. So if you've got a complementizer, you can't have an inverted auxiliary. If you've got an inverted auxiliary, you can't have a complementizer position. You can't have a complementizer. Okay. So there we have evidence then that inversion is in fact another kind of head movement, the movement from the inflection position to the complementizer position. Now, it turns out that we can in fact have both kinds of head movements happening one after the other. We can have the movement that moves the verb to the inflection and the movement that moves the inflection to the complementizer. And what that ends up with is with the verb in the complementizer position. This here is an example of such a thing. Is John happy? Okay, what's going on here? Well, we start off with the inflection, the tense, a bound morpheme sitting in the inflection position and the verb in the verb position. What's going to happen there is in order to support the bound inflection, the verb is going to have to move and stick itself onto that bound tense inflection. Of course, we don't pronounce this as bees, we pronounce this as is because this is an irregular form, but it is just the verb to be plus the tense morpheme. Now, once it's in that inflection position, we know that with inversion, you can invert the inflection and stick it into the complementizer position. And so you end up with the verb in the complementizer position as a result of two different head movements. One moving from V to I and the other moving from I to C. Okay, let's summarize then what we've been through in this lecture. Clauses are CPs. We're going to make the claim from now on that actually it's not just some clauses which are CPs, but all clauses are CPs. There is this extra level on top of the IP. The IP is the complement inside the CP. The CP is headed by a complementizer. Complementizers determine what we refer to as the force of the sentence, and the force of the sentence is to do with this distinction between declarative and interrogative. We've seen that some complementizers introduce interrogative clauses like if, some complementizers introduce declarative clauses like that. And it's the presence of the if or the that which determines whether or not we've got an interrogative or a declarative clause. Note, the IP that follows those two complementizers is identical in both cases. It's not that determines this distinction. So actually the meaning of complementizers is precisely to introduce these kinds of distinctions. In tense sentences, the tense morpheme starts off, as we would expect, in the inflection position. That is the position where inflections start off. But the tense morpheme, being a bound morpheme, must be supported by a verb. And that is going to force the verb to move out of the verb phrase into the inflection position by what we've been referring to as V to I movement. That's a kind of head movement that moves the verb to the inflection. Furthermore, in yes-no questions, we've got another movement that moves the inflection to the complementizer position, or I to C movement. Both I to C movement and V to I movement are instances of a larger group of types of movements known as head movements, which simply move a head from one head position to another head position.